permission? Okay. Thank you.
It's recording now.
Okay, yeah. Thanks. Okay, I will just share my screen. Okay, so first of all, I would like to acknowledge that we are located on Treaty 6 territory and respects the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant community. Next, I want to thank Michael and the EFCL for helping us in organizing this event. Stacy, who has agreed to be our speaker today, and of course, everyone here for taking the time to join us this afternoon. So the project that we're currently working on is co-creating neighborhood climate action strategies in Edmonton, which intends to understand the capacity of neighborhoods in undertaking climate actions through a literature review and community engagement sessions. This research is conducted by a research team at the U of A School of Urban and Regional Planning in partnership with the EFCL and funded by Alberta EcoTrust. So here we have our full team. So Dr. Sandeep Agrawal as the principal investigator, Dr. Nalaksi Joshi as the co-PI, and myself as the research assistant. So our engagement session consists of 3 parts. So the first one was held back then in June 22nd. For those who didn't make it, please do not hesitate to contact either of us or Michael for the video recording. And the second session is today, in which we have Stacy Barter from Building Resilient Neighborhoods. I will introduce her in a bit. And for the last session, we will present our literature review findings and also have a visioning exercise with the links. Okay, so welcome, Stacy. So Stacy Barter is the Executive Director of Building Resilient Neighborhoods, a nonprofit community-based organization in BC. She will speak about relevant community experiences and possible programs that leagues might be interested in adopting. Feel free to leave your questions in the chat at any time throughout the sessions. And after that, Nilakshi will take over and lead the Q&A portion of this session. So yeah, I will just stop sharing my screen so that Stacy can start hers.
Great, thanks so much, Shirley. Nice to see you all, for those that I can see this today. So I'm joining from the traditional territory of the Algonquin speaking people. And this is the territory of the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nation, also known as Victoria, BC. And super excited to share about some of the work we've been doing in Victoria and across BC, but particularly in partnership with the City of Victoria. We've been doing programming at the neighborhood level and actually at the micro level, at the block level for a number of years in Victoria, particularly focused on building resilience to a whole number of issues, including climate change. So I'm just going to pull up my slides. I've got a bit of a presentation, but I'm excited to see some of the intros in the chat just to get a sense of who's here, and really hoping we have some time to chat after my presentation, and happy to share and answer any questions that people may have. So particularly, I'm going to share a bit today about work we've been doing on 2 programs. The first is called Resilient Streets, which we're actually in the process of rebranding Resilient Neighbors. And this program is focused on building connections between neighbors at the block or apartment building level in order to strengthen resilience. And we're rebranding it because it's not just streets, we're also working a lot with apartment buildings. So just to make that more meaningful to people. And then a particular kind of sub-program of Resilient Streets, or a module that we've been working on with the City of Victoria, is called Connect and Prepare. And this is really about strengthening emergency preparedness and social connections between neighbors in order to build community resilience. So I'll share a bit about both of those. Oh, sorry, I'm having a hard time with my mouse doesn't want to let me advance the screen. Hold on. It does this sometimes. Doesn't like me. Oh, hold on. There we go. It's back. So just a bit of context. I'm really focusing on community resilience and climate resilience at the neighborhood level. And our team came together a number of years ago. We'd all worked in community development for many, many years. And we were really interested in why, in the face of challenges or stresses, certain communities seem to have this ability to bounce back or thrive or respond to challenges that come their way very easily, and others it's really a challenge. And noticing that these pressures are really trickling down to the household level. So we were interested in how to look at increasing resilience to a number of different stresses and shocks that come our way, you know, things related to climate change. Someone came onto the call today saying, isn't it nice that we have a day without smoke? This is in our daily reality now that we're living this. But also we know that this intersects with a lot of other community challenges. And we're particularly interested in looking at how do we build resilience that can help people to respond, not just to those acute shocks and extreme weather events of climate change, but social isolation, some of the issues around inequality in our communities, and then some of the health challenges we're having. So what we've seen is that a lot of climate action programs tend to focus a lot on the left-hand side here, responding to trying to look at ecosystem responses to climate change. And this is from Dr. Gary Belkin, who used to be the Deputy Commissioner of the New York City Department of Mental Health. And he's really advocated that, you know, in terms of responding to climate change, absolutely we need to be dealing with looking at what are the responses in terms of healthy ecosystems. But in order to really respond to this, we also need to have a social response and build our social capacity and community capacity to respond. So that's where a lot of our work comes from, is this notion of building social resilience and social capacity. So we think of resilience as sort of like a set of muscles that we can build up, that, as we said, we hope that if we have those strong muscles, whatever comes our way, our communities will be better able to respond. And our particular approach and focus in community resilience is really emphasizing building that local community capacity where everyone's basic needs are met. We're tending to inequities and making sure we're not leaving those who are most vulnerable behind. Often when we talk about resilience, people talk about this idea of bouncing back. And I even used that language when I was referring to the origin of our work in this area. And so part of it is this ability to react and cope when hard times come our way or stresses come our way. But we also think that we can build up our capacity to be more proactive in addressing some of those underlying threats. Climate is a great example. So it's not just about responding and adapting to the challenges. How can we proactively respond to those? But even more so, how can we build up our capacity as communities to actually address some of the root causes that are underlying this? So in the case of climate, we're always trying to look at how do we adapt to this context, but also how do we mitigate it as well? So really looking at that intersection of mitigating the actual what's causing the problem, but then also strengthening our ability to respond to it, because we know we have to live with it. So our work draws a lot from my colleague, Michelle Calusi, who worked for a number of years with an organization called the Canadian Centre for Community Renewal. And they had worked for many, many years looking at approaches to community resilience, largely in rural communities. And we were interested in adapting and learning from that work and bringing it to a more urban context. And really how this idea that place matters, where we live matters, and that really influences our ability to be resilient. And we've developed a whole kind of framework around neighborhood resilience. It's on our website if you want to check it out. I'm not going to get into it in a lot of detail, but we know there's a lot of things at the local neighborhood level that influence our ability to be resilient as communities. Some of that has to do with infrastructure and services, the local economy, how engaged our citizens. All of these things are really, really important to our resilience. But what we found as we started engaging with communities in this work is that there's a whole other set of capacities that are less visible that influence how resilient we are to challenges like climate change that come our way. And some of these are the less tangible aspects of our lives in the neighborhood. It has a lot to do with how we relate to our community, to each other, to the people where we live. And particularly the degree to which we have very strong social networks in our neighborhood really influences our ability to be resilient. So much of our work, and the reason that we created Resilient Streets and Connected Prepare, comes from hearing time and time again about the importance of social networks as relates to the foundation or the magic ingredient of resilience. So we've really emphasized this in our work, that social connectedness, connection between neighbors and people where we live, when push comes to shove, makes a huge difference in terms of how resilient we are in responding to some of these challenges. We know that this matters. We know that social connections and social networks matter, but at the same time, we're finding that as a culture and as a society, we're also having this loneliness epidemic where people are less connected than we ever have been. Certainly, we've seen that during the pandemic. We've had added challenges around that, but that's really come to the fore. I mean, there's been so many reports and so much look at this sort of epidemic of loneliness and how that's playing out in our neighborhoods. So we're trying to find the co-benefits of addressing this loneliness crisis and building our resilience to a number of other issues as well. I apologize, my something's going on with my screen here. Oh, there we go. So looking at if we build social connections between neighbors, we're more resilient because communities are inevitably that are more connected end up being happier, healthier, safer in general. Crime, in terms of crime rates, we see better connected communities, that goes down, but also being prepared for other challenges that may come our way. So Resilient Streets, as I said, the focus of this program is really about building up neighborhood level capacity for neighbors at the micro scale, so on their block or in their building, or sometimes it's a cluster of blocks together, to strengthen those social connections so they can support each other. And I won't get into this in great detail, but I know part of what you're looking at is program models. So I just wanted to share a bit about the model. Really, we have a host of different partners within the community who work together, who are interested in strengthening social connections as a foundation of community resilience. We work to offer inspiring ideas of what neighbors could do to come together and strengthen their resilience together. We engage neighbors in workshops to learn about ideas, and then we offer support through very small grants to remove financial barriers for people to take action. And then what we found over the years is that we have sort of a growing group of resident champions who are interested in building resilience. And when they share their stories, that inspires others. So in essence, that's the basic of the model. And we are encouraging and activating neighbors around working together, getting to know each other, strengthening their networks around 4 key types of activities. And some of these, when you look at them, may seem like, well, what does this have to do with climate change? But I always think back to a conversation I had with, just a really great organization in San Francisco with the city of San Francisco called the Neighborhood Empowerment Network. And they do a lot of work around emergency preparedness and resilience at the community level. I was talking to the leader there about different programs they had in the city of San Francisco. And I said, oh, you've got this great block party program, and then you've got your emergency preparedness programs. And he said, oh, well, those aren't separate. The block parties are a foundational strategy for building resilience and emergency preparedness. So again, just this idea that by building connections and strengthening those networks between neighbors, we are inherently building resilience. So I'll share a little bit about the types of activities that we're trying to encourage neighbors to undertake together. And really, the key for us is that by coming together and working together on a small project or getting to know each other, that will make the difference in the long run to when we have more severe events that come our way. So the first kind of bucket of activities, we call it like the gateway, the easy start, are gatherings and celebrations. So the classic block party, encouraging neighbors to come together and do seasonal celebrations, cultural celebrations. But we've also done a lot of work around this notion of a party with a purpose. One of my favorite, one of our partner groups in the North Shore of Vancouver kind of coined this term, a party with a purpose. And they used to host parties with the fire chief to have people come together to learn about energy efficiency and look at opportunities within their block to do retrofits within their homes. So that would be a great example of a party with a purpose. This is another example from one of our Connect and Prepare groups where we worked with an apartment building of seniors with disabilities. And these two women who were the champions, they participated in Resilient Streets, and they started by realizing, we're a community of low-income seniors and food security is really an issue. And so they undertook a project to establish a group of neighbors to build partnerships with some local food organizations and bring food and food recovery programs into the building, because many of these seniors couldn't leave the building, for example. And then they went on from there to participate in Connect and Prepare, brought neighbors together to learn about emergency preparedness, and they decided to have a party with a purpose where they would teach people about getting emergency prepared. They realized that as low-income seniors, none of them had kind of basic equipment in terms of emergency preparedness kits. So they hosted a grab-and-go party where everyone came together and built their emergency supply kits. And as part of that, of course, they're doing education about some of the hazards and risks that we face in our community, including a lot of climate risks. So that's one example of sort of a party with a purpose that we've supported. The second bucket of activities that we're encouraging neighbors as they're strengthening their relationships to work on together, placemaking, or sometimes passive animation, where we're using physical infrastructure that can help neighbors interact and get to know each other. So, these are some of the classics that we see around our communities. And I'm sure with some of the programs you have had happening in Edmonton, I know Abundant Communities Edmonton supports a lot of activities like this, really creative ideas of working together. One of the ones that's been really influential in the city of Victoria is we have a great boulevard gardening program. So a lot of emphasis on food security, neighbors working to strengthen food security together. And this one is another example of what's come out of our Connect and Prepare program, where we worked with a group of neighbors to develop a public infrastructure project on a street boulevard. This is an emergency supply bench. So the neighbors worked together and we brought a team of designers to help them design this bench. It's sort of an interesting design, but basically the seat of the bench houses an internal storage compartment for the neighbors to house shared emergency supplies. But it's also meant to be a repurposing of the street boulevard to create a space for neighbors to sit together, to have conversations. It's their muster station in the event of an emergency. There's solar panels on the roof so that they can use it for backup power source. And there's a community bulletin board on the back. So this is, I think, again, a great example of neighbors coming together to learn about climate risks, take action together to become more prepared, but also really strengthen those social connections in the process. The third of our 4 buckets of activities that we're supporting is this idea of just stronger mutual aid and neighborliness. So these are some examples from the pandemic where some of our Connect and Prepare participants created postcards to reach out to their neighbors, to check if people needed any help. Creating buddy systems is one that we've seen a lot within Connect and Prepare. Again, looking at opportunities to foster that kind of sharing and neighborliness, that classic idea of, I know I can rely on my neighbor if there's a big event, but also maybe I just need to borrow a cup of sugar and want to head over there. And then the fourth area that we're really supporting is this idea of neighbors coming together to learn together and take a deeper dive. And this is really where our Connect and Prepare program fits as a module. So neighbors coming together to learn about something in particular. And I'll share more about Connect and Prepare. When we first started Resilient Streets, our first project was building off of a program out of the States called Transition Streets as part of the international transition movement. And this is an example of sort of a deeper dive where neighbors choose to come together to learn about opportunities for energy transition. So this was a pilot we did with a street in Victoria where neighbors came together over a series of several weeks. There were different modules on food, waste, water. There's sort of a do-it-yourself booklet to work through and learn together about some of these issues. And these are some of the results of this group of neighbors working together. You know, they did energy audits. They ended up installing heat pumps. They did some bulk buying for local food. Tool sharing. They did a whole piece on their transit use, but it really was that process when they tell the story of coming together and doing it together that made the biggest difference, that they ended up having a very strong community coming out of that. So share that just as an example. I'm happy to share that link with Transition Streets if that's of interest. So, you know, and these things make a difference when we've measured the results from folks who participate in programs like Resilient Streets. We're seeing that people really are making those connections. And the biggest difference is that they're really starting to help each other out and realize that they can rely on that in the future, and a much stronger sense of trust and hope and sense of belonging in communities, which, you know, someone said, you know, when we're offering these little micro grants within Resilient Streets for $50, $200 for neighbors to come together and do an activity, that's a pretty good result that people say they've got an increased sense of hope and that they can rely on each other. So it doesn't take necessarily a lot of resources. In some ways, this can seem quite simple, but the impacts can be quite profound. I wanted to share most particularly about Connect and Prepare because I think it's the most relevant of our work, and it's really where we're putting a lot of our energy these days in terms of your focus on climate action. Again, this is more on the end of climate resilience and climate adaptation, but always we're holding this lens of how can we ensure that we're doing this in a low carbon way. So the emphasis of this program, this is our partnership with the City of Victoria Emergency Management Department, is looking at building community resilience through a focus on emergency preparedness, social connectedness, and building a culture of neighbors helping neighbors. And we're really trying to look at how can we be better prepared for those big events, but also look at strengthening long-term resilience. So we can so often focus on the big events, the big shocks, the fires. I was just sharing, my father was just evacuated during a wildfire on my vacation. You know, these are, we all know we're facing this all the time. And so being more prepared together rather than just individually is really critical to our response. But also going back to that idea of building up our muscles for resilience, we need to be looking at being resilient to the long-term stresses as well. So food security, you know, health crises, as well as these chronic stresses that we may be facing day to day. How can we as neighbors support each other better? So traditional preparedness, this has been a learning for me as we partnered with emergency management, has tended to focus a lot on those big events and the short-term response, and really what can we do at the individual household. And so Connect and Prepare is an approach to looking at this collectively as neighbors. So it's really important to be prepared within our own households, but how do we ensure that we actually are looking at more of a collective response? So this image is from the tsunami in Japan, the earthquake and tsunami in Japan, and a study that was done in Northeastern University, which looked at what really made the difference in disaster response in that particular context. And the blog title was "Social Ties, Not Sandbags." So just really emphasizing that we can have all of the equipment and emergency equipment in the world, and that does matter. But at the end of the day, it's these social ties that really is what makes a difference to our emergency responses. So we're trying to, again, shift this focus on individual preparedness to a real asset-based focus for communities and neighbors working together, looking at how can we support each other in the event of different emergencies and stresses that come our way. How it works is we partner with the City of Victoria and our nonprofit team. We work together to offer a series of 3 workshops to groups of neighbors. They're hosted by resident champions, often in people's living rooms or common rooms, or if that isn't possible during the pandemic, we've been doing a lot of outdoor workshops here on the coast. We can get away with that. And then also, drawing on some of our community resources. And we work through a series of workshops which help neighbors to look at their strengths and vulnerabilities around different risks. Here on the coast, there's a lot of emphasis, of course, on earthquakes and tsunamis, but we're also looking a lot at climate risks, such as extreme heat. It's an area we've been working on a lot, and fire and flood and some of the other risks that are more climate related. And the neighbors then work together to develop some strategies and projects like the ones that I've been sharing with you in an action plan together. So again, these are just some images of different projects that people have done together coming out of the program. All of them are setting up these sort of shared emergency supply kits, but it really is the process more than the product that really makes a big difference. And again, really pretty meaningful impact that we're seeing, that when we evaluated our pilot program, we found that everyone was saying they became more connected through the process and they had a better understanding of their strengths and vulnerabilities and were taking action to be better prepared for emergencies together. And I think those that said they got to know each other better, there were some who already knew each other, but most of them got to know each other better. In terms of what does it take to do this? Again, I know you're looking at different models and options. So I'm threw in some of the nuts and bolts here. We do have the equivalent of about a full-time position. It's actually 2 half-time positions to support neighbors in these workshops. We offer these micro grants, and then the city is partnered to offer each Connect and Prepare site $500 worth of shared emergency supplies. So that's a really big incentive for a lot of groups of neighbors who are interested in participating. And then we also help them leverage other grants if they want to do projects in their community. And right now, we've had experience scaling Resilient Streets to 3 other communities in BC. So we've got some train the trainer materials, and we're in the process of developing that for Connect and Prepare. So just extending an invitation that if this is at all relevant, we're looking for opportunities to work with other people to sort of take this approach other places. As I said, we've found that most of the approaches to neighborhood emergency preparedness tend to be more focused on that individual level. So we're really excited about this approach that's more focused on groups of neighbors, and thinking it's really making a difference in terms of people's climate resilience. So I will stop there. I'd love to know if people have questions. I just fired off a lot there, so feel free to let me know if there's anything I can expand on that would be interesting or useful to you. If people have, if you want to turn on your video, it's really nice to see you, so we can have more of a conversation. I would love that.
Thanks a lot, Stacy. That was a very, very interesting presentation, and many interesting points. As you might have noticed in the chat box, there were many questions popping up. So I take the liberty of moderating the Q&A session. I have just noted down 3 questions that popped up. I don't know if people would like to ask their questions themselves. I see, Rocky, that you had an interesting point about social networks being institutionalized. So would you like to jump in?
Oh, always. Well, yeah, I was just thinking, I mean, it sort of relates to some of my more cynical comments below, that unless these social networks are used to replace some of the networks that have evolved to, okay, let me see. It's, geez, Dr. Joshi, thanks. Let me just try to gather my thoughts. So, okay, let's take insurance, for example. How could I, that's an institution that to me sort of seems set up to sort of replace the old community barn building kind of thing. If your barn burns down, everybody gets together and builds you a new one. How could I give up something like insurance? I would really have to gain something, which is really strong community. And I do think that gaining community feels good. It feels really strong. But like there's so many cultural shifts that are needed at the same time, because right now I just feel that I would have a hard time convincing my neighbor to even share a lawnmower with me, because my neighbor wouldn't want to be beholden to me. There's so many cultural influences that kind of hoop us. So I don't know, that was just a bunch of, I just spit out a bunch of stuff that doesn't really feel coherent even in my own mind, but hopefully it kind of speaks to the question.
Yeah, I mean, I can share a few reflections, Raquel. Is it Raquel? Is that right? Yeah. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think, our theory of change, whether it proves to be true or not, is that we need to start at that super micro scale to actually influence some of those cultural changes that you're talking about. And that by having positive reinforcing experiences, we can slowly actually start to transform that and get back to what you're talking about, which is that kind of barn building, barn raising culture that so many of us are quite nostalgic for, right? And yet feel like quite a loss in terms of what's actually going on in terms of the culture in a lot of our neighborhoods. So I really resonate with what you're saying. I also resonate with what you're saying about that some of the under the surface attitudes that have kind of creeped in. Like I live on a street where it's a fairly affluent neighborhood in Victoria, and I wanted to be the cool, resilient street. It's actually evolved to become quite a cool street, by the way, but it's taken a long time. And I was very uncomfortable to, I thought I'd love to have this kind of culture where I can knock on my neighbor's door and ask for a cup of sugar or borrow their lawnmower. But exactly what you just said, that's not the culture of my street. And yet slowly, by starting to do things together, I've now got a situation where I trade eggs from my backyard chickens with my neighbor who's got a lawnmower, because I don't have a power lawnmower. It works great. So I do have hope. I do feel optimistic, and I totally get the questions, and I have my moments of cynicism as well. So I get it. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Jonathan there, I see your hand. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Melanie, I'll follow you up.
No, go ahead, please.
Or whoever was talking, sorry. Well, first off, Stacy, thanks. This is kind of, fundamentally really exciting stuff. And we're lucky in Edmonton to have the EFCL, a coalition of neighborhoods that's a long time in development. We are lucky to have ACE as kind of our home base in Edmonton. One of the things that this sort of sparks a question in my own head is, as people are more and more kind of feeling a disenfranchisement, whether it's loneliness, whether it's feeling impacts of climate change, whether it's increasing inequality, I think that what this is, and what I'm seeing it doing, is inspiring people to want to organize in their neighborhoods to create a vision.
Mm-hmm.
And more neighborhoods are kind of doing these grassroots trial and error visioning exercises in their neighborhoods. And the question I'm always or often asked by communities that are working on this kind of thing is, okay, so we have our vision, but what are we actually allowed to have an input on? So they get through the vision, and then they get to the point where they're asking themselves, okay, like, where is my capacity to actually affect this change. And I think that that is kind of where your model comes in really well. And I would love to know about more about the actual, I guess you called it the model or the 3 workshops program, and how you're getting some of the unique place-based issues, opportunities, perspectives, and then actually linking that with the capacity in neighborhoods to make it happen. So what are kind of the processes of facilitating that capacity building?
Yeah, those are great questions. So I guess a couple of things that I want to highlight that I think are relevant to some of what you're asking. One is, I will say that I think our partnership with the municipality is really key, because, and for a whole host of reasons, it's been a great and authentic, true partnership, and we're lucky that we have a really progressive city with a progressive city staff, but they help remove barriers and they help navigate systems where citizens might bump up against some of those limitations that you're talking about. So building those relationships with folks who can navigate systems and remove some of those barriers is really, really critical. Whether, you know, these are very small micro examples, but that neighborhood, that neighbor hub that I shared the photos of, that couldn't have been possible without having the city on board to get all the permissions from transportation and engineering and et cetera, right? So us doing, as an NGO, doing the work to have that kind of strong relationship with those navigators is really key. And then in terms of your question about sort of the process of the 3 workshops, I buzzed through that slide very quickly, but you're absolutely right that it's very place-based. Every group of neighbors that we work with is unique and different, and it really is about taking stock at that very local level of our strengths and our vulnerabilities and building an action plan from there. And one of the things that's sort of key to our approach is this idea of like a menu of options of ways to take action. So we've been at this for a number of years, and climate change has always been a huge driver in our work, but we're actually quite explicit, except in Connect and Prepare, where we're digging into some of those climate risks, in not using that as the only pathway in. So giving people a whole suite of options of like, this is how you can build resilience. And you know what? It's going to help you in this situation or this situation or this situation. But you may be the group that wants to go at it in terms of emergency preparedness for climate risks, because that's your jam. And that might not be where a lot of people want to start. A lot of people want to start where it's like, I actually just feel kind of lonely and I want to know my neighbors. I'd like to feel more connected. You're still going to get to the same place ultimately. And so we're really deliberate in not emphasizing a very narrow focus of ways to take action. And then the last thing I'll say is partnerships with community organizations are really, really key as well. So there are neighborhood associations, being able to link. So all of these groups, as they kind of come up with their action plans, we're just supports to connect them with other resources in the community that may enable them to move forward together, whether that's, you know, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a good example, which I'm not coming up with off the top of my head, but there's countless different examples of other organizations who can lend support and help them go to the next level.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And I see Reg has his hand up for a while, and then Owen, you're next.
Good, thank you. This has been a very helpful conversation, and I'm glad we're having it, because what I've been finding in some of my experience is all of these, I'll call them special interest groups, that are all converging down at the neighborhood level for attention. Here in Edmonton, there's a group at the University of Alberta that's working on a project that has federal money called Healthy Housing. Mm-hmm. And you know, then there's this initiative that's growing out of the Federation of Community Leagues and the University of Alberta that's got more of climate focus. And I see Howard's on the line here too. And then there's another community initiative called Abundant Communities. And all of these things are the nexus is the neighborhood. And there's almost a sense of, at least my experience, and you know, others may have different views, of being inundated by all of these very valuable, very profound initiatives, which from my perspective seem to be siloed.
Mhm.
I don't know if here in Edmonton, healthy communities, abundant communities, and this community resilience have at the leadership level ever sat down and talked about where's the synergy, where's the build? Because Rocky and I and others get inundated with emails from all three of these agencies. And you're saying, you know, my wife's going to leave me at some point. She said, you're married to your damn computer. And so there has, I think, there's specialization, and that's important.
Yeah.
But there's also, and where the success comes, as you've pointed out in your presentation, is when this convergence happens, when things are building. And that gets back to I just posted a note about the careless society. I think there's actually a typo in that. It should be care blankless society, where John McKnight talks about institutions, professionals have taken over the aspect of care that you were talking about. And what Jonathan talked about is, I think there's an initiative. It's small, it's growing, and it's neighbors trying to take back, in a sense, take back care from the professionals. We need those professionals, but they need to be enabling us, not doing for us.
Yeah.
And that's the big challenge. And I think your process talks about that. Abundant Communities talks about that a little bit. The reference I made to Cornelia Butler Flora, she's been doing research on capital, neighborhood capital for, I met her in the 80s, and she's still working on it.
Mm-hmm.
So these are all important. And I think what you're touching on is how neighborhoods can leverage this. I also think there's a little bit of this pandemic fatigue. There's also a little bit of fatigue happening with climate, and that scares me an awful lot.
Yeah, yeah,
and
we've certainly.
Yeah, and I do have that book about rekindling democracy. It's on my bookshelf. So anyway, that's my rant.
That's great, Ed. Can I respond?
But I think it's important what you're doing, and thanks for sharing it. It's brilliant.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to pick up on I really resonate with what you're talking about, and I see I wear a few different hats. I work in a lot of different communities, and time and time again we see this kind of siloing of the best intentions and great initiatives, but not necessarily having a very integrated or joined up approach. And I'm not suggesting we've nailed that perfectly, but part of the model of Resilient Streets, again, we're rebranding it Resilient Neighbors, we tried to create a platform for community organizations who have a mandate or an interest in this type of work to come together and create a collaborative partners table that then can funnel out resources to citizens with their own specialization. So we've got folks like here, we've got Block Watch with the police who are interested in resilience and social connectedness from a crime prevention perspective. We've got emergency management coming at it from that angle. We've got certain newcomer organizations coming at it from more of the belonging and inclusion, intercultural lens. But it is important for us as organizations, and sometimes we need to push our municipal partners a little bit because they're classically siloed in a lot of contexts, it is important that we do that work of integrating and creating a seamless opportunity for citizens to engage and access different opportunities and resources. It's really, really important that that work gets done. And it shouldn't be the work of citizens to have to navigate all these different silos. So we've really tried to make that a fundamental part of the model and how we operate. But yeah, someone's got to take initiative to make that happen.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. And I am just mindful of the time. I think we have still time for one more question. Owen, I saw you raise your hand at some point, so please go ahead.
Hi, everybody. You guys can hear me? Okay, great. So I come from a little bit different perspective, and I just sort of saw this through following things on Facebook and stuff. I'm not the professional. I am the guy who is just in my community. I was formerly a network admin, ended up sick, been off work since 2015. So I've been living in isolation before the isolation happened, kind of a thing. I do still stay in touch with a number of friends, some of them that work either directly in climate science or in agriculture. And those private discussions have been at best disturbing as to what we're looking at facing. So when I saw this, I mean, I just wanted to kind of introduce myself from this different perspective and kind of throw out some things I had on a piece of paper before this sort of a thing. So one of them is a perspective that I've picked up through following a guy, Professor Jem Bendel from the UK. I think he's actually now in Indonesia or something or other. Wrote a paper in 2018 called Deep Adaptations. Some of you may have seen that or not. And I think that's part of what I took from it was deep adaptation is talking about at our larger institutions and things, we're really failing climate change, the ability to do so, to take action and stuff. And that it's about starting to have those conversations personally within families or within small community as to how are we going to adapt, because some of this is more severe. So some of the things I had on my mind coming in here, and I think you've answered some of those, some not as far as our Edmonton directly kind of a thing, but I had things down like emergency services and community liaisons. Where's the tie between emergency services and our communities? And I think you've looked at a bit of that, but I'll dig into some more research and information on how that's working in my neighborhood sort of. Mm-hmm. There's been a lot of reduction in emergency management services through a need for efficiency. And unfortunately, that is going to leave things lacking and on local neighborhoods and neighbors and communities to deal as things come up. I really like as well what you were talking about, because I had something down here about change. When we're looking as far as climate change goes, I see that as our biggest issue is psychological. It's not an issue in trying to present and have people look at and review the data. If they actually would do that, I think we'd have a lot more people on board in looking at this as a real issue, but it's psychological in you know, preconceived ideas and stuff. I talk to people that are highly on board and well informed and they know all the data, and others who are very emotional about it because it's going to affect their job, especially in Alberta here in some of the sectors, and they don't want to talk about it. Mm-hmm. So it's hard to sort of create that community that way. And another problem I see is we're very disconnected with the natural world, and you've addressed some of that. But I mean, it's quite apparent that animals, insects, and plants are understanding the changes that are happening in the environment. They get 1.5 degree climate change. They get changes in biodiversity and everything else. It's humans that don't. And I think the only way to deal with that is more one-on-one in smaller things. So I just want to say thank you. Like, these are some great ideas. for trying. I am that guy on the block that goes and bangs on the door when somebody new moves in, and that's something that I don't see a lot of. I'm probably the only guy on the block that now has a few of the houses knowing each other. Other than that, it doesn't happen. So I think these ideas are fantastic, and I'll be looking more into it and stuff as far as how to do that, because to me that community building is also something else as humans I don't see us very good at, is long-term risk management. As you said, short-term, well, put some water in your basement, you know, some blankets, store up some canned food, kind of a thing. But a lot of the other thinking to me seems to be very based on kind of the next quarterly, and that's not, doesn't seem to be happening on a larger scale. It's about kind of next quarterlies or over the next short term. So maybe it's individuals in small communities need to get back to this idea of more thinking long term in what's going on as people move from one generation to another, kids growing up, or people that are having kids moving into being seniors with kids leaving the nest and stuff. How do we build and maintain those connections? So
yeah,
those are just things I kind of had on my mind coming into it. And
yeah, thanks, Owen.
thank you very much.
Yeah, I really appreciate you sharing those thoughts. And yeah, the transient nature of our communities is definitely adds another layer of challenge. Just, I know we're almost out of time, but just one reflection is just, you know, I talked about the kind of menu of options of ways to build communities, but the other thing that I found that can be really effective is in terms of coming at some of these climate challenges that you're talking about, is it's doing it by stealth. So, you know, people, again, I just want to say, people might not want to talk about climate. There are lots of people who do. And there may be some people who don't want to start with a conversation about climate and these big issues, but they are concerned about getting emergency prepared. And so that's a great gateway, actually, for a lot of people, is using the short-term emergency preparedness as a way to get at the longer-term resilience and climate resilience conversation. So I'll just leave you with that. But we found that really does open up doors that we're not really overt and explicit about at the beginning, but it has impact over time.
Thanks a lot, Stacy, for that last thought. I see that there is a lot of discussion in the chat section, and a 1 hour session, I think, cannot do justice to this existential problem that we're dealing at, but unfortunately we've had just 1 minute today. It was nice to hear all that you're doing, as well as some of the feedback that came from community members. And I would encourage all the participants to look at some of the work that Stacy has been doing. Melanie requested for some of the resources. We will reach out to you for them and then circulate them among the participants today. Yeah, a big thank you to you for joining us today, as well as to all the participants who took out the time. Just a quick announcement before we leave. We have the next session, which will probably be a final session in this series, which is scheduled for late September or early October. We'll reach out to you. And that is when we try to put all these pieces together that we've been talking about on how do we start at the neighborhood level, if we want to address climate change. So yeah, once again, thank you, everyone. I don't want to hold on any longer, because I know you have your lunch coming up. Or everything else, if there's anything that was not answered today, please send out those questions to us, and we will share the recording of this session with all the participants as well.
Thanks so much for having me. And I just put a little plug. I'll try and respond to the chat questions, but also anyone feel free to reach out to me directly. And just to plug again that we are looking at ways to bring Connect and Prepare elsewhere. So if it is of interest, please feel free. Oh, I think I froze.
Yeah, I think you froze just right there.
You got the message. Thanks.
Okay, then. Yeah, thank you everyone, and I think we'll hang around here for a bit, but yeah, feel free to enjoy that lunch, but don't forget that to act at your neighborhood scale.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.